Hey, it's Seraphin, and today's video is by popular demand an updated version of our ultimate basic Asian bread recipe. If you followed our more recent videos, you'll know that we changed the way we make and use Tangzhong or Yudane. We now use much more gelatinized starch than before, and the results are all the better for it. Naturally, this recipe, like the older version, uses both Tangzhong and Poolish. Poolish, our favorite pre-ferment, lends flavor, makes the bread softer, and helps the dough by making it more extensible. Fantastically useful if you're shaping the dough like we are. With a better understanding of the interactions of the ingredients and their emergent properties, we've also adapted the ingredients to suit the science. The salt content is limited to 1% of the final bread's weight, following health guidelines. The milk we use replaces 25% of the water, an amount shown to best improve taste and texture. We also use around 6% of fat, which is a pretty sizable amount. This softens the bread further and also helps it last longer. And we also cap the percentage of sugar used to 6% based on studies on gas production and yeast activity. Okay, technical facts aside, let's get down to making this ultimate Asian bread. This is a relatively big recipe compared to most of our other recipes, and we're also shaping the dough differently. We're going to make it into a beautiful pan of bread like this. Of course, you can scale it down or up to make it shokupan or other shapes of bread as you wish. There's definitely no limit to what we can do with a versatile dough like this. Making this ultimate Asian bread means we're going to start with two of our best methods for ensuring better texture and flavor, Tangzhong and Poolish. When preparing the Tangzhong, what we like to do is prepare the flour we need in a small bowl, in this case 20% of our total bread flour, 85 grams of bread flour, and then we set that aside, take the bowl we're making the Tangzhong in, and pour in the boiling water, 135 grams here. You may observe that the ratio of Tangzhong is slightly above 3 parts of water to 2 parts of flour, which is different from the 2-to-1 ratio we regularly use, but that's alright. There are many ways to make Tangzhong and it makes no difference. So, right away after the flour and water are in, we combine the two together with our wooden rolling pin. This way of making the Tangzhong prevents lumps of flour forming at the bottom of the bowl and also helps us quickly hydrate all the flour, which is particularly helpful because when we're mixing the flour and hot water together, we've got to keep in mind that starch gelatinization needs a minimum temperature of 65 degrees Celsius to occur. So it's crucial we have most of the flour combined before the temperature drops further. At this point, it's a straightforward process as we cover the Tangzhong and let it stand until it comes to room temperature. It's ready to use now, but we rarely do so and prefer to keep it in the fridge overnight instead, a process that confers the Tangzhong more benefits in flavor and texture. Now we have one more thing to make, and that's the Poolish. I could probably close my eyes to make Poolish, but it never ceases to amaze me with the amount of flavor it can bring when done right. Here we set aside about 23% of our total flour for the Poolish, which comes out to 100 grams of bread flour, and since the water is in equal proportions, that means 100 grams of water. As for the amount of yeast, we use a well-tested amount of 1/4 of a teaspoon. The order of ingredients is water first, then yeast, and finally flour, since, as explained, adding water first prevents the formation of clumps of dry flour on the bottom when we mix everything together. A small tip, but it helps to ensure a homogeneous mixture, and it really shouldn't take long until it's a dense mixture with all the flour hydrated. It will be rough and lumpy though. This is not a reason for concern. We simply want it well mixed like this. We now let the yeast work their magic, leaving it for 4 hours at around 28 degrees Celsius. If your room temperature is very different from ours, say colder, make sure to either extend the time for fermentation or increase the amount of yeast slightly to speed up the process. Either way, the subsequent phases of the Poolish should look the same. Within a few hours, the Poolish will go from rough and lumpy to smooth, and eventually it'll go up, rising from the yeast activity teeming inside, forming numerous flavors from enzymes breaking down complex sugars and proteins into simpler sugars and amino acids, nutrients for the yeast and flavor precursors for us. After enough time, you'll see the Poolish has gained a sponge-like texture thanks to the yeast gas production and the gluten. This is why using pre-ferment like this in bread making is frequently called the sponge and dough method. Alright, these are all our ingredients. With all of them ready and properly placed, mise en place, we can make our final dough. I'll preface the mixing process by saying we're using a stand mixer to make the dough, so this is our stand mixing bowl. And into it, I'm going to add our Tangzhong first. Let that just drop in. The enzymes in our dough will have a riot with all the gelatinized and damaged starch. After that, we throw in our very bubbly and stretchy Poolish, making sure to scrape in all those beautiful gluten strands with our spatula. Then we pour in 76 grams of milk. Liquids first before flour, again to prevent the flour from clumping at the bottom. Then 25 grams of sugar, 7.5 grams of salt, or a bit more than a teaspoon, a fourth of a teaspoon of yeast, and 240 grams of bread flour. On the side, last but not least, we have 30 grams of softened butter to be added after the dough has undergone a few more minutes of mixing and developed some gluten. So we lock the bowl into our stand mixer fitted with a dough hook attachment. Start on low for about a minute to prevent flour flying everywhere. And once it's roughly combined, we take the speed up to medium-high for 4 to 5 minutes. The mixing time is dependent on a bunch of factors, our derivative ingredients having a major influence. Tangzhong, as we've covered before, makes the required mixing time longer because it takes more time to mix the colloidal system into the dough. On the opposite side, Poolish, partly due to its gluten network, actually reduces the mixing time needed. After some of our own tests, we found these mixing times to be able to get the optimum consistency for this dough. And after the first round of mixing, we should get a dough that looks like this. Appreciate it for a minute because we're going to make it fall apart by adding the butter. Turning it to low first to combine and then to medium-high. We want to let it run for another 5 to 6 minutes. It looks like the dough is falling apart as the fat coats the dough and prevents it from reconnecting, which is alarming, but within minutes you'll see signs of the dough coming back together until eventually it becomes smooth, well-developed, and ready for the next step. We stop the mixer, detach the hook, and before we get the dough out, we're going to line our hands and a bowl with some oil. Any vegetable oil will do, just to prevent the dough from sticking. With our hands well covered, we can now get the dough hook out of the bowl, and after that we'll do a quick window pane test. This was a fantastic result. You can clearly see how thin the dough is capable of stretching, likely thanks in part to the Poolish and our bread flour. So we plunge in with our scraper, scooping up the dough, getting every bit. I wouldn't say it's a very sticky dough, but it is pretty tacky. We're also rounding it out with our hands, just shaping it in the air. As long as you lined your hands with oil, this shouldn't be difficult. Then it goes right into our bowl, nice and snug. We cover with this glass top, all the better to see the dough with. And now we leave the dough to bulk ferment for 30 minutes. We've made this a pretty speedy fermentation by cutting short the time, partly due to our addition of instant yeast to the already teeming Poolish in our dough, and because our room temperature is also quite warm. We're also taking into account the time it'll take to shape the dough. Since this shaping process is quite elaborate, we've taken some time off the bulk fermentation to make up for the time needed to shape the dough later. That's why just 30 minutes later, or when the dough looks relaxed and has risen to about 1.5 times its original volume, like this, we're done. Okay, it's time to divide and pre-shape the dough. The first thing to do is uncover the dough, then dust the work surface and our hands just lightly to make sure the dough doesn't stick. And after that, we punch the dough down, degassing it. Then we gather it out of the bowl, placing it on the work surface. We want to divide this into 21 equal pieces with the help of the scale, and the way I'll do that is divide first and then measure and correct. So the first and easiest step is to just divide into 3. And then take these pieces, cut off what's roughly 1 piece from each. Divide the remaining doughs into 2. And each one of those into 3. This is the quickest and neatest way I've found to divide the dough into so many pieces as evenly as possible. You may need to dust with flour a little bit here and there. The weather is very warm here, so we do need to dust a little more often. To make sure they're equal, we put each piece of dough on our scale to get around 37 to 38 grams each. Cut out a little bit from the ones with surplus and add those little cuts back to the ones that are too light. We repeat this until we get all the pieces to roughly the same weight. Then once they're all done, we're gonna round all of them into little dough balls. Just super simple, rounding them in our hands, using a little dash of flour here and there to prevent sticking. We don't necessarily need to have the dough be perfectly taut and smooth because it's just pre-shaping. We will be rolling these out later, so we don't want the dough to wind up being too tight, just smooth enough to look round. As we move from piece to piece, we're trying our best to make sure the whole process goes by as fast as possible as the fermentation is still ongoing. Now, it may look like a lot, but rounding the dough is a super simple and fast process. 21 pieces will fly by as they did for me. Oh, it's actually quite satisfying watching them line up like that. A little messy in order, but hey, we're literally going to be shaping them in a few minutes. So we cover them and let them rest for 5 minutes. This rest is important because it will help make the dough much easier to shape. And here we are after the break. We now get to the fun part, shaping. You already know what we're shaping them into if you watch the opening, so let me show you how to quickly and easily shape these gorgeous little rolls. We dust with a little flour and then we take a dough ball. We're following the same order as when we pre-shape them to give them all the proper rest time, making sure it's got enough flour on it so that it doesn't stick. We then roll out one edge with a rolling pin so that the dough forms a triangular shape. It's a kind of pressing forward until the dough sticks down and then rolling back to spread the dough out. To fix any mishaps, we're also using our fingers to better straighten out the sides. When it looks like this, we're going to roll it in from the side, and to be clear, the way we want to roll it in is so that it's parallel to the center line and not the side of the triangle. This is important so we get a nice straight and kind of triangular roll of dough, using a little bit of flour here and there again to prevent sticking. We pinch to seal before we put it aside. And repeat for the other dough pieces first. This is to give the dough some time to relax because we're going to roll it out yet again later. And it might look tedious because there are so many pieces, but really it goes by pretty quickly once you get the hang of it. The main key is just to press the rolling pin down as you push forward so that the tip of the dough sticks to the surface. You could also just smash it down with your fingers, like I'm doing here, before rolling out the triangle shape. The scraper is a big help here, especially if the dough hasn't been dusted with enough flour. We also don't need to roll the dough out too much. It doesn't have to be very long or wide. We just want to make sure the sides are neat and the shape is about triangular. I pinch the seams shut for each one, but I'm not doing it very hard because the dough is quite adhesive and unlikely to fall apart. It's just for precaution's sake. All in all, I think these 21 pieces took around 6 to 7 minutes to do, and then we were done. All right, we now have all of these triangular rolls, which is great. We'll take a brief intermission from shaping the dough to lining the glass baking dish we're using. I'm using some pre-made non-stick lining. You could also just use some oil or butter. And we're spreading it all over with our handy silicone brush, getting it in every nook and cranny so nothing sticks. When that's done, we move our lined baking dish to the side once more and continue. So to get our final croissant-like shape, we take one of these triangular rolls, dust well with flour, and then flatten it out using our rolling pin. It should come out to a nice and long isosceles triangle. We can use our fingers to straighten out the sides like before and adjust the shape. Then we're going to cut the bottom like so before rolling the dough up slow and steady, making sure it's neat and tidy. Keep going, and there we go, we have our finished piece. From here, we just need to repeat for the rest, 20 more pieces to go. Cutting the bottom like that helps give us a bit more width, and I do think it makes the rolls look nicer. You could skip it, of course. When rolling the dough out, we are aiming for it to be pretty long since the rolls look good with many layers. This is a strong point of this dough, by the way, since, as we mentioned, the Poolish really lends extensibility. This dough is nice and stretchy, which really helps here. I tend to go a little slow when rolling up to make sure the dough stays on the center line. It would be a bit unfortunate to have a crooked shape. That's why I'm being careful. I'm also taking caution with the sides of the triangle. They need to be straight so we don't get wonky results. Again, using flour as necessary. This dough does lean on the tacky side, not extraordinarily sticky, but you do need to dust it with flour, otherwise it might get pretty messy. I always have my scraper handy on the side, just in case anything sticks, of course. And with this final piece, the final stretch into a triangle, flattening it with our rolling pin, cutting the bottom, and then rolling up into that beautiful shape. Great, we're done. Now we just need to arrange the pieces into the dish. I do this in 3 slanted rows of 7, like so. I love how this turns out. Feel free to experiment with your bakeware to get your perfect fit. After they're all in, we'll cover this and let it rest for about 40 minutes at around 28 degrees Celsius here, or until they almost double in size. Make sure to cover them well so that they don't dry out during this time. Before they're done proofing, we also want to make sure to set aside enough time to preheat the oven to 175 degrees Celsius. Alright, now with the oven done preheating and our dough ready, we just have one more step to do. It's not crucial nor essential, but it's the cherry on top that'll make our bread look beautiful. We're gonna brush the dough down with some egg wash made with 1 egg mixed with around 1 tablespoon of milk, just using a silicone brush to spread it. The egg wash with milk will give us a gorgeous brown shade thanks to the Maillard reaction. This reaction requires amino acids and reducing sugars to happen. With this wash, the egg provides the amino acids and the milk throws in the reducing sugars. Lactose, that's why we'll get a deeper brown color than if we were to go without the wash. When we finish giving all the dough a layer of coating, we're going to also decorate with some sesame seeds. This is a really cool way to do it. Taking a rolling pin, we dip one end in the egg wash, let the excess drip off, before covering that end in sesame seeds. Then we sort of stamp the dough with the seeds, leaving them in a lovely circular shape, repeating for the rest of the dough. It's fantastic. And here's the end look. Now it goes straight into the oven, middle rack to bake for 15 minutes at 170 degrees Celsius on top and bottom heat, before switching it to bottom heat for another 5 minutes. It takes a glass dish a little longer to heat up while the top turns golden brown quite quickly, so we switch to bottom heat at the end just to let the bottom brown a little further. With that, we're done. Being very careful, we'll take the bread out of the oven. And now for some shine as well as flavor, we brush this down with butter quickly while it's hot. Now, let me tell you, this bread was so soft and decadent. It was pillow soft, and you can see these circular patterns in the crumb. The biggest contributor to flavor was definitely the Poolish, giving the bread complexity and depth. This Poolish was complemented by the Tangzhong, which added sweetness and made the bread much softer. The quote, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts," definitely applies here, and I'll also add that this bread still tasted fantastic after a day, remaining soft and yummy. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and bye!